Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good, good. How did you survive your week? You had testing, right?
We did, yeah.
Yeah.
We started testing. There's
It's
been a lot
over.
in the last couple weeks.
Uh-huh.
We had an eclipse.
We did.
I think we talked about that right
That was
before
great, by the way.
One of the coolest things I've ever seen.
Experiencing an eclipse in the path of totality is very different from everything else, and you absolutely have to do it. You have to do it. You've got to go see it the moment when it goes completely behind the moon. I've never seen anything that looked like that. It was the weirdest, coolest thing I've ever seen.
It was the coolest thing ever, yeah.
This
I agree.
halo of light.
I was not as excited as you.
I know, because you're not as big of a space nerd.
I'm not.
Which is okay. I forgive you.
But it was so cool.
was
It
really
got so still and so quiet, and there were no birds. There was nothing.
Yeah, nature got very quiet.
Yeah, and then humans being humans, they all started clapping. I love a good clap. You know what I mean?
We drove to an outlet mall, and we got there really early because we weren't sure. It was like apocalyptic, the amount of traffic people were expecting around here, but it ended up not being that bad. But we
actually were in the part where, up on the Ohio-Michigan border, people were in traffic for like 6 and 8 hours.
That wasn't us.
We were not.
No, we were on the edge of it, but still, we got there really early because we didn't know what to expect. And by the time the thing happened, this parking lot of this outlet mall was completely packed with tailgaters, much like us. So
it
we
was
were
cool.
standing outside. All these people were around. It got really cool for a few minutes, and then, yes, everyone clapped. There was applause.
It got
afterwards.
chilly.
Like, clapped for the sky. Yeah.
I love that. I love when people are like, how do we show
Move
that
to
we
applause.
like what we see?
Yeah.
Clap. It's like when a plane lands and people clap.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that because when a plane lands, like, that's what it was supposed to do.
The real communal experience.
We shouldn't clap for a plane landing unless you're currently on a Boeing, in which case you might clap for that landing, but...
I mean, you could make the same argument for the eclipse. It is what the sun is supposed to do sometimes.
I also... This is just me being a dense person unaware of, celestial things, but somebody on, I'm going to guess Twitter, showed, like, other planets and their moons and what it would look like for their eclipse. We got the coolest thing ever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I did not realize that this was not how it would be for any
Right.
planet. And we're actually very lucky that it is as cool as it is, because other moons are like not the same shape or like whatever, and they're smaller or larger and they don't fill each other, like whatever.
Right.
Very
They
cool.
wouldn't create this thing that I'm talking about being in the path of totality, just like this halo of white light in the sky. And you could see these, I think they were like these coronal ejections or something happening. You could see these like weird little pink streaks of light coming off the side of the sun in a couple of places just because of the way, it was so neat.
Well, and we got to take off our glasses, which made it so
Yes.
cool. And so then like you're standing there and it's like 20 degrees cooler than it was. It was just so cool.
Yeah.
So if you're at any point near one, or you can get to one, it's worth doing.
It's worth the drive, the extra drive. If you're close-ish, it's totally worth the extra drive to go get in the path of totality. So that's my thought on the eclipse.
My parents have seen 2.
That's neat.
They have been in the path of totality twice.
That's cool.
So last 2 weeks we started testing. There was an eclipse. We're surviving.
One housekeeping note before we get into the headlines for today. If you wouldn't mind, we would love to have you sign up for our educator newsletter. To do that, just go to 16to1.com, scroll all the way down. It's on every page. Just go ahead and submit your email. You'll hear from us, news, updates, new episodes, interviews, resources, other events, things like that. So just make sure you get the latest from 16 to 1 and from Moonbeam Multimedia. We're following up yet again on the FAFSA rollout, which has been disastrous. So recently, some Senate Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden, sent a letter to the CEO of General Dynamics Information Technology which is the company that received more than $120 million to revamp the online free application for federal student aid.
It's a lot of money for it to not work.
Oh, wow, it is. The letter states that the FAFSA rollout has been a, quote, near total failure, end quote, and that the problems caused by this failure have created a crisis of credibility for the education department.
True.
Not gonna lie, I agree with that assessment.
So far, everything is true.
The FAFSA rollout has been plagued by technical difficulties, delays, and last-minute adjustments, many of which we have covered in other episodes of this show. This has all led to a 40% drop in FAFSA completion among high school seniors compared to the previous year. This has caused also significant issues for colleges, which were expecting to receive FAFSA applicant data much earlier to create financial aid offers for incoming students. Many colleges have had to push back key deadlines as a result. Both Republican and Democratic lawmakers heavily criticized the Education Department's handling of the FAFSA rollout during a recent congressional hearing. Senate Republicans are skewering the Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona, about this, and I think he kind of deserves a bit of skewering because this has been just a colossal mess. We talked about this when we first started getting news about the problems with this rollout, and we compared it to the early
Obamacare.
days. The early days of the online Affordable Care Act portal. It sounds so very similar, and it's striking to me that we didn't seem to have learned from any of the issues with that. It feels so very similar. It's just...
How did we not learn anything?
Getting some deja vu.
For the next time.
Yeah. So Miguel Cardona seems to be trying to shift some of the responsibility for this rollout onto institutions of higher education. They apparently had to set up some sort of account or mailbox to receive data from the Department of Ed about FAFSA as part of this rollout, and I guess maybe not all of them have done that or didn't do it by deadline or something.
So he's looking for an out.
Yeah, I just want to say, as a software architect, we do everything that we can to avoid scenarios where a human has to take some sort of positive action for something else to happen down the line. And I feel like this is one of these scenarios. If deadlines are of the essence, you don't want to count on a human receiving some communication from you and responding to it. So if that was a blocker, then that was just like a bad design, in the rollout of this system. And second of all, if you're the Secretary of Education, it's your job to make this transition happen smoothly. So it may be the case that colleges haven't caught up to where they should be, but again, it's part of your job to
do it.
Get them to that finish line.
Right.
So if you haven't brought, your higher ed partners fully on board, take responsibility for that. And the folks that I know who work in admissions are absolutely losing their minds about all of this, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
It's chaotic. It's causing so many problems, and I am a little bit worried about what's going to happen in the incoming freshman class of colleges and universities across the country. So, okay, what's our next headline?
All right. On April 12th, the Biden administration announced an additional $7.4 billion in student debt cancellation for another 277,000 Americans.
Yes.
And these were all Americans that have been enrolled in the SAFE plan and other income-driven repayment plans, and also the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program.
Yes.
The latest round of debt relief comes on the heels of the Biden administration pursuing an alternative path to debt cancellation through negotiated rulemaking after the Supreme Court blocked the administration's original student debt relief plan. So they're still looking for a way.
They're chipping away at it. Okay. Last headline. It hasn't been all that long since we covered the story about how Harvard had pledged to keep its test optional admissions policy for applicants through the class of 2030. However, update. Just last week, the school announced that it will resume requiring test scores in applications for students applying to the class of 2029. So they actually moved it up a year from what they had originally pledged.
I don't like that.
Shortly after
if
that...
If you pick a date, it's your date.
Shortly after that, Caltech also announced that it was reinstating its test score requirement. So rest in peace to an extremely short-lived experiment in test optional admissions policies. I'm, I guess, unsurprised. This seemed to be the way that things were going to go. I am a little bit surprised that Harvard flip-flopped so in such short order.
Yeah.
Like, they were just like, no, we're going to stick to our guns and try this through 2030.
No, we're not.
Just a few months later, no.
No.
I remain a bit disappointed just because of the role that high-stakes testing plays in the admissions picture. We just have a lot of work to do. So anyway, Harvard walking back its previous commitment there. And then just the final item, Teacher Appreciation Week is still on the horizon. Runs from May 6th to May 10th, 2024. Plan ahead. Find a way to acknowledge the teachers in your life. Get them a little treat. Send them a little word of encouragement.
Or a 12-pack. Oh.
Liquid encouragement.
I meant send them a 12-pack of Diet Coke. Cheers.
Cheers, teachers.
All right, what are we doing this episode?
This episode, we are dealing with literacy, as we often do. We are going to provide...
I never deal with literacy, so this is news for me.
You never think about literacy?
What? No.
We're talking about the science of reading, specifically. I was starting to feel as though we need to give an update on where things are evolving.
I think we bring back Book It and we solve it.
Book It? Book It is the answer to everything.
So far, you can't tell me it wasn't a factor.
Pizza for reading. Let's go.
And just like I said in the Book It episode, I'm still highly motivated by those things.
I'm still food motivated.
But really, what's the update? What's happening? What's not happening?
Well, we're going to talk about the science of reading. The cycle of curricular chit-chat is once again very saturated with people talking about the best way to teach people how to read. This is a pattern.
It is.
We just cycle through.
I just think education has a funny way of rebranding and stamping fancy words on things. But in this case, this is actually something that needs to be a huge focus for schools.
This back and forth has been evolving for really decades now. And yes, it is a case of everything old is new again a bit, but we'll see that it's complicated. So let's just get into it. Earlier this month, California's Assembly Bill 2222, which would have transformed reading and literacy instruction statewide, languished before it was even given a hearing. This controversial bill had won the support of the California State PTA and more than 50 state advocacy and education organizations, but the one entity that really needed to be on board more than any other was the one that ended up mothballing the bill. And that's the California Teachers Association, and that's the biggest teachers union in the state of California. They sent a letter to the Assembly Education Committee opposing the draft of this literacy bill. And I think that the letter itself can be an important case study for states across the country, as many of us work through new legislative initiatives in the wake of some startling literacy statistics. We've got a real problem with literacy in this country, and now everyone is scrambling to address it because there's been a lot of media attention on it. And we've talked extensively about this in other episodes, but I will just share one more time for good measure. American Public Media has sold a story, How Teaching Kids to Read Went So Wrong, which is a podcast series that addresses this issue that we're going to be talking about, but we're going to be dealing more with the current legislative update and where things are evolving. So, what is our literacy problem, and why is this the way that we're trying to address it?
I mean, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, I found some data from the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, and her foundation states that 54% of adults between the ages of 16 and 74 years old lack proficiency in literacy, and that means that they're essentially reading below the equivalent of a 6th grade level. Newspapers in the United States range anywhere from like a 7th grade to like a 10th grade, 11th grade level, depending on what type of medium you're reading.
Interesting.
It's a little scary to think that over 50% of our adults are not even able to read some of the most common outlets for news and information, which is a little concerning. But the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy also said that counties with the lowest literacy rates are the same areas that experience poor health, poverty, and low economic mobility.
Yeah.
And there is a really strong regional divide in the United States. The Midwest and the Northeast have much higher and more regionally consistent literacy rates, whereas in the South and the West, they can vary really widely from county to county even.
So, as I've mentioned, American Public Media's Sold a Story is the definitive podcast resource on our current crisis of literacy, how we got here. It also sets up the kind of opposing camps of this. And that's like the balanced literacy / reading recovery people on one side and the science of reading people on the other side. And it's not that simple. I'm oversimplifying the camps here, but that's generally how these things are shaking out. Tell us just briefly, what is the science of reading?
According to the National Center on Improving Literacy, the science of reading is research over time from multiple fields of study using methods that confirm and disconfirm theories on how children best learn to read. It is based on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension.
Okay.
So here's what it's not. It is not a program, an intervention, or a product that you can buy.
Yeah.
It is not a phonics-based program that drills only phonics skills. And it is not complete. There will need to be more research done as time goes on and on. It's a living, breathing goal of learning how to best teach reading, if that makes sense.
The current best research-backed practices that we know of for teaching literacy.
What I interpret it as is a group of people saying it will keep changing as we keep learning and understanding better.
Yeah. Something that we set up in opposition to like vibes. Like we don't want to have a
what?
We don't want to have a vibes-based approach to teaching literacy, which is just that like, well, we feel that this is helpful to students.
Vibes.
The
vibes are off.
The vibe is that this is helping my students.
John Locke says the vibes are off.
Yeah. Whereas the science suggests that this
It's not
other
at
thing
all.
is helping my students.
Sure.
It's
I
really
hope
just
you don't think teachers are just vibing.
No, well, I mean, we'll get into it because it can feel that way sometimes in some of these oppositions to the science of reading.
Sure.
It does feel a little bit like I like my vibe and I want to stick to it. So we'll get there.
Okay.
It's complicated. Yeah.
It is.
Can you set up how reading instruction methods have evolved just in like the last couple of decades? Maybe let's start with the 18th, 19th centuries. I don't want to go all the way.
This is
way
very
back.
brief for you.
A very brief history.
Normally we have to go to the first day on Earth.
We have to go to the
For
first
you.
humans,
Yeah.
usually.
Okay, so the Enlightenment era brought a focus to education. People like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they helped include an idea of universal education. So at this point, we see primers come into schools, like the New England primer, which included stories, religious texts, and illustrations. At this time, there was also a focus on phonics-based instruction. And another interesting factor in the 19th century is advancements in psychology and how to use what we understand about children to help better develop reading instruction. And I think it's really funny that we only then decided that, hey, maybe we're understanding kids a little bit better and we should think about what would actually benefit them.
Yeah, I think this is the very beginning of what the science of reading looks like now.
I just think it probably could have started before then, but I'll
that's-
take it when I can get it.
No, I mean, I think it's an interesting point.
And also because of the rise of public schools, educators adopted basal readers, which were textbooks that provided graded reading materials. So the 20th century, in the 1920s and the 30s, we witnessed the emergence of the whole language philosophy,
Yeah.
which emphasized meaning and context rather than isolated phonics. So then in the 50s and the 60s, we see a resurgence of phonics-based approaches with the launch of Rudolf Flesch's Why Johnny Can't Read,
Why Johnny Can't Read.
and the subsequent focus of phonics-based reading programs. And so since the 1970s, there's been a lot of back and forth between prioritizing comprehension, vocabulary development, and fluency. And if you grew up like us in the 90s, then you absolutely remember the Hooked on Phonics ads,
Yeah,
which kind of throws us to where we are now in this great debate.
it does. I think the 80s and 90s, though, are when this balanced literacy and reading recovery approach started to take hold. Like you're saying, it just kind of swings back and forth between these two poles. And there's some people who will make the argument that this is a false dichotomy and that we shouldn't be arguing for one or the other. And teaching reading is really about finding some sort of golden mean. But anyway, take us through, if you would, the core components of the science of reading when people are talking about that now.
Sure. There are 5 core components. Phonemic awareness, which is the ability to identify, manipulate, distinguish individual sounds and spoken words. It involves understanding that words are made up of separate sounds and being able to hear, blend, segment, and manipulate those sounds.
So that's like looking at the word cat and going, k, at.
Yeah, right.
Like,
Research has shown that phonemic awareness instruction is most effective when students are taught to manipulate the phonemes with letters and when taught in small groups.
in small groups. It makes sense to me in general that smaller class sizes help with literacy instruction.
Yeah,
That's
this
just a
is
no-brainer.
Probably also ability grouping
Yeah.
as a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so another factor is phonics, which is the relationship between letters and sounds in language.
Oh, so that's more what I was talking about. Okay.
These two things go really, really closely together. So it involves understanding how letters represent sounds and using that knowledge to decode written words during reading and encoding words during writing. So many people have the misconception that the science of reading is solely based on phonics, but it's just one piece. I would say that as an English teacher, phonics is probably a larger piece than others, because once you have those down, you can do a lot with them.
It's foundational, yes.
It is. So fluency is the ability to read text accurately, quickly, with proper expression. And students with strong oral fluency skills are more likely to succeed in other areas of the literacy acquisition process.
Makes sense.
So this is understanding like how we use tone to ask a question or to exclaim how excited we are or
Convey
whatever.
meaning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Vocabulary, the words students must know to communicate effectively through reading and writing. It would also include understanding and the meaning of words in context.
Yeah, this is one that I'm sure gets tricky because in the balanced literacy approaches, context is very important.
Yeah.
Maybe gets weighted to be more important than it should be at certain points along the process. But yeah, that's a point of contention with balanced literacy. Okay.
And then the last one is comprehension, which is just your ability to understand and make meaning from what you've read. So this would include using background knowledge, decoding skills, your vocabulary, your critical thinking, all of these things to construct a meaning. And so reading comprehension itself is the application of multiple skill components. That we understand what we have read is important. And this is where my students usually fall off a lot of times. But I think that hearing them as 5 separate things, like they don't exist singularly, right? All of these things are playing with each other for it to work. But this is just
like,
kind of the components of that type of learning.
This is everything you have to keep in mind to have a successful approach to literacy.
Yep.
Okay, I want to start to get into some of the very real implications for educators that are happening right now. You have some extremely firsthand experience with this because here in Ohio, our governor is very gung-ho about science of reading initiatives, and we'll kind of get into some specifics there. But there are some big changes coming down the pike for teacher education, for teachers who are already in the classroom. Let's talk a little bit about how this science of reading affects classroom strategies.
I will say it's hard to completely change how you've been teaching something. Let's just start here. It's hard to admit you're wrong. I have a hard time admitting I'm wrong. I think every human probably hates to admit they're wrong, right? Like, I think that that's a foundation of humanity.
It's not fun.
Nobody wants to be wrong. So I can imagine the struggle and the stress and the fear of failure and everything else that could happen to, especially a kindergarten through 5th grade teacher, to have to completely revamp everything that they've ever done.
Let me hone in on just this one part in particular so we can all understand what the wrongness is here. There are a couple of things with this balanced literacy approach. We've talked about this in other episodes, but the 3 cueing method, which is a way of helping students understand what they're reading by telling them to basically look at context clues. That's one thing that has been explicitly banned. I think in Ohio they've actually banned that altogether, but in many places that approach is part of the problem. So that's when you're talking about how we've been taught to do something wrong, that's the sort of thing that we're talking about.
And that's something I have to change.
Yeah.
Because I have even in a text with students been like, okay, look at this sentence. What could these things possibly mean when we read them as a whole?
I don't think that the science of reading says that you should never use context as a tool to understand.
Yeah.
But
there's a fine line between...
yes.
So I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is I need to be more aware of the ways in which I'm encouraging that type of, you know what I mean, studying.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of, like I should probably start by looking at the word specifically and breaking it down by its parts. Well, and then build from there.
It's hard for you. You teach high school. So
I do.
This... many of these concerns are going to be impacting K through 5 teachers-ish, but this does have implications downstream for educators of all grade levels and
Right.
ages and things like that. But the issue here is that colleges and universities who do teacher education have been
Teaching
influenced.
teachers.
Yes, they've been
Incorrectly.
influenced for very many decades now in one way or another. And part of why this is so tricky and difficult is because a lot of educators think that what they're already doing is based in science and research
Right.
and child psychology
You
and
think you've
developmental
been-
psych.
Yeah.
You think that what you've been taught adheres to what everybody thinks is the best practice for how students learn. So
Yeah.
that's
It's a hard
the whole
thing.
that's the kind of premise of the Soul to Story podcast, actually, is that like these institutions of higher education need to be held accountable for the ways in which they've failed teachers, in addition
yes.
to the way teachers are unfortunately currently failing students with
For sure.
literacy instruction. So anyway,
So
that's the backdrop.
So the basis, though, for building the change, right?
Yeah.
To help correct some of these things. So, for example, in the state of Ohio, and I'll get into more of what the state of Ohio is doing to support teachers, according to the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. But if you are a teacher in Ohio and you teach grades kindergarten through fifth, you are going to have to complete a course sequence by 2025, summer of 2025, 22 hours of training. Okay. And the classes are online and they range from introduction to evidence-based language and literacy to data-driven decisions, phonics, vocab, fluent, okay, all kinds of things. So we are talking that in the next 15 months, these K through 5 teachers have to get 22 hours of this training in.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
this is
not easy.
No. This is Ohio's response to the science of
Right.
reading. This is like we passed this bill, House Bill 33, whereas California has decided not to pass
Right.
it. So we've barreled ahead, and teachers here have very similar concerns to the ones in California. So we'll get there. But yeah, tell us more about. So you've got to do 22 hours of professional development.
That's K through 5.
Okay.
That's a lot of stress to put on any teacher in 15 months. 22 hours in 15 months is a ton of work. I mean, they have to be starting like now to get these things done. And the other thing is that this is not the kind of work that you want them to fly through. Schools have a hard time supporting teachers to get professional development, even in the terms of just getting our next license renewed, right?
Yeah.
Let alone supporting them and completely changing how they've been teaching reading. So this House Bill 33 is going to require all teachers and administrators to complete a course provided by the Department of Education and Workforce no later than June of 2025, the end of June. And there are some exclusions, but I'm going to suggest that probably doesn't apply to too many of us. And so that was me finding out that I need to figure out what I need to do by next year because I'm one of the targeted teachers. Because the state has set aside $43 million each fiscal year to help support schools and teachers in getting that proper PD. But the state law requires that a teacher of grades kindergarten through 5 does this, an English language arts teacher of grades 6 through 12, an intervention specialist, English learner teachers, reading specialists, instructional coaches, any of those that service pre-K through 12.
Wow.
So all of those groups of teachers now have to do, if not the full 22 hours, then at least some course that the state is offering.
And you've got a stipend of up to $1,200.
Yeah,
to
and I
do all that?
jokingly told Chelsea that they're giving us $1,200 for each of the following. So based on that, I would assume I would get $1,200, but you know the classes could be like $1,500.
Yeah. I also thought it's interesting. There's a stipend up to $400 available for each teacher who teaches a subject other than
Yep.
English in grades 6 through 12.
That's not going to encourage anybody to go do it
Yeah,
because they're going to have to pay more. So why? I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about. We've talked about ODU a million times already. I'm happy that they've earmarked $43 million to try to help schools support that PD need, but I have my doubts, and I hope that they start communicating this to teachers, because I can tell you that until we started prepping a podcast on this was not in a follow-up email to me.
Well, this is very much hot off the presses. I
Right.
mean, this legislation is brand new, and there are many states grappling with it right now, and everybody's trying to do stuff as quickly as possible.
Yep.
There's urgency finally around this question because there's been huge learning loss post-COVID too. a bunch of factors are just kind of converging here so that this is becoming a big priority right now. So.
Yeah. It's going to be a lot for the state of Ohio, and the state of Ohio is not in a great place generally with their education department, with our teacher crisis, with our retirement concerns.
Teacher shortage, yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of pots on the stove, pans on the stove. What's that phrase?
Irons in the fire?
Irons in the fire. We'll go with that. We got a lot of those too.
Okay.
Isn't there a lot? Too many?
There are a lot of
chefs in the kitchen? Are these mixed metaphors now?
There are too many things where there shouldn't be that many things.
Yeah. Ohio is juggling a lot of issues.
So many metaphors.
I'm mixing them all.
We're mixing all of the metaphors.
We love a good mixed metaphor, but we have too many balls to juggle and not enough hands.
I want to get your take on each of these points that were made in this letter. So the California Teachers Association broke down their opposition to Assembly Bill 2222. They kind of broke it up into 4 points. The first one that they talked about was curriculum and instruction related. The association was claiming that the bill doesn't have a consistent definition of the science of reading, but that it also tries to enshrine a standard for the science of reading into legislation. So it's kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too, and maybe doesn't do a very good job either way. So the letter said that the bill would carve into stone scientific knowledge that by its very nature is constantly being tested, validated, refuted, revised, and improved. That's a quote directly from the letter. The fluidness of the concept could lead to confusion over what is and isn't allowed in classrooms. I think this is a bit of a double-edged sword. Too much flexibility is what has led to our current literacy crisis. Too much confusion over what is and isn't research-backed, what is and isn't scientific. But I also understand that trying to capture an entire approach to thinking about learning and legislation is likely to go badly. It's going to be really hard. Like I said before, there are a lot of teachers who were under the impression that what they were already doing was scientific in its approach to child psychology and education and stuff, because their formal education and professional development to this point has made them think that. And that's not by any fault of their own, really. So like balanced literacy and reading recovery, these people still advocate for their methodologies by saying that they use research too. And they will also imply, like I said earlier, that the science of reading is like a media-driven frenzy to sell phonics instructional materials. They will say stuff like that. And because it is true that there are entities that are trying to profit from particular curricular approaches, this is always going to be a tricky point. I don't know. It's like the Spider-Man meme where everybody's pointing and blaming. So the second point that the California teachers were objecting to was about credentials and professional development. This is a quote from the letter about the Assembly Bill 2222. The bill set up a top-down approach of mandates for professional development. In the top-down statewide mandate approach of AB 2222, the professional development requirements do not reflect the values, priorities, and cultural context of the local community. And it also said the professional development requirement in the bill will be very costly, and the bill does not have an appropriation. That second one seems so very obviously problematic to me, that all these science of reading bills, a lot of them mandate huge requirements of professional development to retrain teachers. The thing that I struggle with a little bit here is this friction about the top-down approach to a professional development mandate. Because this very problem of literacy, the fact that so many people are not up to a 6th grade level of reading in this country is because we have this patchwork, haphazard approach to the science of reading. Right. And I don't know that in and of itself, when it comes to this very thing, the fact that different teachers want to do different things is what is the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I have the same concerns about the cost, for sure.
Yeah.
And the time to support them. I'm going to bet that your classroom is going to require different resources to support this shift. Will they be supported in buying those things? Because if you're not buying the resources to support the shift, then there's no, I don't know. It's a lot of money. That's what I've kept, like that. That's what I've been telling you the whole time.
Yeah. I think the other thing that these teachers point out in California is that the bill conflicts with some existing literacy measures, some of which were passed as recently as 2022. So there's an objection in that the approach here is kind of haphazard and is because there's internal conflict with it because of everything else that's been going on. So I get that. The one other thing that I did not like so much about this letter, they call out this section where apparently teacher training programs are receiving some scrutiny. And here's the quote from the letter again. Threatening a teacher training program with the removal of accreditation does not prioritize the well-being of students, the integrity of the education system, and the professional reputation of the institutions involved. I think I disagree with this. And
yeah, because we don't want these programs to keep thinking they're doing it right.
If a teacher training program has a vested interest in a method of reading that has been shown to do harm to learners in the long run, I think if a teacher training program insists on still teaching that method, that maybe we should revisit the accreditation of those programs.
I agree with that.
We have this problem in Ohio right now because some of the biggest proponents and originators of balanced literacy and reading recovery are at OSU and have been at OSU, Ohio State University. We're in this weird state of tension where our governor is rolling out these science of reading initiatives and trying to get educators on board. And one of the most important institutions of education in the state is continuing to hold on to
the old thing,
the method that is in conflict with the science of reading. Yeah. And now I'm completely willing to understand that these things are not cut and dry. They're not straightforward. And that the people who are fans of this other approach don't think that what they're doing is in conflict with the science of reading. So I get that that is a tension that needs to be worked through.
Yeah.
But on the whole, if we're failing our teachers by teaching them methods that are going to set their students up for failure, we absolutely, yes, we need to hold those institutions accountable.
I agree.
Okay, so the third point of debate in this AB 2222 was about language acquisition. This one is really difficult for me because I do not understand the nuances.
Yeah.
The bill, this is very nitty gritty, but it gets boiled down to English language students. They're mentioned in the bill, but it does not address their multifaceted needs in a comprehensive way, according to this letter. So like the definition of the science of reading is in these teachers' minds kind of too wishy-washy to guarantee that English language learners will be given tools and strategies they need as a distinct group of learners with distinct learning needs. I totally get that because if you're trying to have a one-size-fits-all definition of the science of reading,
it's
you're
difficult.
Very likely to miss some of the nuance involved.
I don't have experience as an ELL teacher to know what that looks like.
I was digging into it a little bit, and it was some of the same kinds of concerns that you were expressing, like, well, how do we say for certain that every single example of using sight words, which is a big thing in this literacy approach, like the status of sight words is kind of endangered here. You were saying when we were preparing for this episode, like, how do we know for certain that every single time you would use a sight word, it would be bad for long-term literacy outcomes? And I'm completely willing to believe that there's not enough research to know for certain how best to handle these.
Yeah, I'm not either.
These cases. So, and then the very last point of contention here was about assessment and testing. They were saying that AB 2222 would undermine existing literacy efforts and divert attention from other efforts that are either still in progress or need to be funded to be implemented as intended. So they're like, you've already told us we have to do all this other stuff, and you haven't given us any funding to accomplish any of this other stuff we're also supposed to do. So why don't you quit pulling the rug out from underneath us so we can do our job?
Imagine what kind of whiplash these poor teachers are feeling if they just did the training for the literacy measures passed in 22, and now they're being told 2 years later, oh wait, actually throw the baby out with the bathwater this time and let's start. You know what I mean? Okay. That would be so frustrating.
It would be. However, here they come back with this other quotation. Limiting instructional approaches undermines teachers' professional autonomy and may impede their effectiveness in the classroom. So like people are very upset about 3Qing being banned.
Sure.
That has been proven to maybe help students in the short term, but damage their long-term literacy scores, basically. So, yes, that's a limit to an instructional approach. if the instructional option is bad for students, then limiting it is not bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's very nuanced. It's very
is.
difficult. I want to hear a little bit from, because you have some experience with like coworkers and your own experience that helps shape some of this a little bit.
I was raised by a Title I reading teacher. There's a factor of my life. I grew up reading Sally, Dick, and Jane books.
Yes.
My first stuffy that I still have, her name is Sally. I love those books so much.
Stuffed animal?
Yeah. But I named her Sally because I was reading my parents' readers from their childhood.
That's cute.
One thing to mention about the California teachers. I can imagine how frustrating it would be to be told in 2022 that this is what you're doing, spend all this time to revamp, and then being told in 2024, this is now what you're doing. And this is going to be a more permanent thing, and it's better. Because if there's one thing that teachers are always told, it's that this is better than the last thing. So I can tell you that we get sold so much of this stuff that even when we're told this is tried and true and there's all this data, we're going to be like, because we hear it.
Absolutely.
And so I can understand where these California teachers are coming from, certainly.
Yeah.
The other factor for me is that being an English teacher, my students are awful at comprehension. They could read it, they can spell probably most of it. But if I told them to summarize what they just read, they could not do it.
Yikes.
And that's where they're missing it. The other thing that I've seen, most of my friends now have young children ranging from, little babies, just over a year old, to middle schoolers. Okay. So I have heard, as their kids are coming up and through, their frustrations in some of these programs because their children went from high achieving, high marks, whatever, as a reading student. And then because of whatever program they started using, getting knocked down and that causing other issues like behavior issues or whatever. These are some of the things that come of these huge shifts. The professional development aspect is the most important thing that we can be doing to help teachers change, because some of what my coworkers seemed frustrated about was the teacher had the basis for how the model worked, but didn't know yet how to scaffold or how to support or how to differentiate to already different levels of learners.
Yes.
And it's because a lot of professional development is like baseline, here it is. But something like this is best taught in small groups, which means that you have to know how to differentiate and scaffold your kids accordingly.
I mean, absolutely. I can totally imagine where this change means that a student who had formerly been assessed to be doing pretty well in reading now is no longer assessed to be doing well in reading. So it's no wonder students could be frustrated by these shifting standards and approaches. How do we assess the effectiveness of methods of classroom instruction like the science of reading or balanced literacy or 3D cueing or any of these things? What should teachers do when quote unquote experts in the field are telling them one thing and then there's data elsewhere that paints a different picture? A lot of this is just kind of like flying over your heads at all times, and you're just there to kind of pick up the pieces afterwards and try to do the work of really helping your students. I don't know how you would even have time to sort through all of this dialogue that's evolving about this. But like, how do you as a classroom teacher, how do you look at this kind of raging debate and decide what is best for your students?
It's so hard. It's so hard. I think I even said this in the letter to teaching that I recorded a couple of years ago on here, that like I had to keep learning, right? Like I never need to be set in my ways. I have to allow myself to change. And I think that's one of the hardest things, because the longer you do it, the more comfortable you get and things work. And they work. Or
you feel like they work.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and maybe based on how you're measuring them, they do. Right. And so that's the hard part. And that's what I was talking about earlier. It's hard to feel like you've been wrong or that you've done something wrong or damaging or whatever. And so it's a very humbling moment. But I also know I have sat through in the past couple years some really bad professional development that's been put on by my own school district. My district has been doing literacy training for a couple of years now.
In response to some of this stuff?
In preparation and response, as just kind of
They're aware.
It's a focus area for my district. Okay. And if that was the focus, that would be great. Instead, English teachers were met with, how could you include more literacy in your classroom? And we had to answer a question like that. And we all just look at each other and we're like, are we getting punked? I'm looking for like a camera somewhere. I'm like, did you just ask the English department how to include more literacy? That's kind of our thing. That's like, actually, we get paid for literacy.
So you're saying you need not only more, but more quality,
Yes.
professional development.
Yes.
Okay.
But that's the kind of training I've had to sit in. Does an English teacher need to be asked how to include more literacy in their classroom? Probably not. And if they do, then they're not doing a good job anyways.
Yeah.
But that's why these experts are really hard to take information from sometimes.
Well, okay. So let me ask a more pointed question about some stuff related to that. And that's about administrative supports. What should school administrators be doing to not only get language arts teachers on board with some of these changes, but also help them transition?
Give us time.
Yeah.
Time is what we need. You need to find ways to support us, to get us subs, to get us money, to get us meaningful professional development, to allow us to go to meaningful professional development. That's flexibility. That's what it has to be. I mean, there's been some really great professional development that I've tried to get money for to support because it's just too expensive and we can't get any support. And so it's hard. It's really hard. And not that some of the money shouldn't come from teachers because it's part of us keeping our license, which is sure, that's my responsibility, but there has to be a better way to support this.
Well, yeah, let me ask a follow-up about that because I think there's a tension embedded in what you're asking for because, which is not a bad thing, but you're saying we need time, we need resources, we need funding behind all of this. But often with that kind of funding, at least from like the state level, there are strings attached that take away some control.
They do.
From local educational institutions. So how do you think that this question of local control versus state level legislation and versus even national initiatives, like how do you
Common Core or something?
Yeah. How do you deal with this notion that this takes away some control from educators? Like, how do we bridge that gap where, well, there may be many educators who are trained in ways that have kind of been disproven and now we need to bring them up to speed?
Yeah.
Like, but how do you kind of address that? How do you build coalitions where teachers feel like they are included in these conversations, but that if changes need to happen, they can be mandated? How do you balance all of that?
Gosh, I can't even, who did DeWine have advising him as far as the state when they decided on a reading, whatever, what are those groups made up of? Who are they made up of? And something you and I talked about a lot when we were working through kind of what we felt about this was like, education is something that everybody has an opinion about because everybody's experienced it in some way. And I can tell you as a teacher that I get really tired of being told by people who do not do anything near what I do how I should do it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people I could certainly learn from in terms of that, but that they have to have a lot of skin in the game. And maybe that's my own protective way of trying to help myself because I spend a lot of time hearing from a lot of people who have a lot of bad takes.
That's my thing.
And
is that, like, your hesitance to accept the newfangled thing is justified when you are asked to invest so much time in, for example, professional development opportunities that aren't rich and meaningful to you.
Something else I've talked about a lot is as a 10th grade English teacher in Ohio, I'm tested. My first couple of years, I did one test and then we got switched. And then that was a whole new thing that we had to revamp. We had to completely change how we ask questions. We had to completely change how we did written responses. It's a hard shift when the thing that most teachers rely on most is data and we get slammed in the first couple of years of testing because we're trying to get our feet under us. It's hard. And so we did have to find PD. And that was also when I signed up for a couple of groups within the state itself to get on committees. It gave me access to people who worked on the test so that I could pick their brains to better understand it, right? But that was something that I had to do and I still do. And so it's helped me, but it's a lot of work. And that's in addition to the other things that I teach, So again, I think teachers need a few more hours during their day. I think we need like a 30-hour day. I think that would be a good change if we could work that in somehow. I'm into the cosmos. I think we need to be millionaires.
Well, I think part of my takeaway here is that the teaching profession is uniquely situated. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess I probably shouldn't say that because every profession, anybody pursuing any profession should be willing and eager to learn the latest and greatest and like hone their craft and always be striving to be better and more informed and all of this stuff. So I don't mean to say that this is like only teachers should be doing this, but you're uniquely positioned to do more damage if you fall behind in what is the best practice.
And that weighs on me.
Because it goes out into the world, into other students, and then gets perpetuated.
I feel that stress because the way that I spend my year teaching my kids how to write is what best benefits them on the state test, right? But when I send them to my coworker who's a junior teacher, the way that I've been best preparing them for that test isn't the way to best prepare them for the ACT written portion.
Well, you're asked not to teach to that test, but you're also...
I need my job.
Yeah. You can understand why working in that context would be exhausting for a professional.
It is.
Well, we'll keep following this story. I'm sure there are going to be some evolutions in how it's even implemented here in Ohio. I don't know whether California will revisit this bill or not.
They might not.
It's off the table for now.
Yeah. Can I stand on a soapbox?
Sure.
If you are around children, school-age people, model for them reading. Read with them. Have them read to you. There's so much data that shows how invaluable reading at home is. There's really no replacing that time. I think that's some of the best work that we can do to help our students get ahead on these types of things, but also to help support teachers as they're transitioning through these changes, is that keep them reading at home. Don't let school be the only place your kid's reading. We're going to jump into our fill in the blank portion of the episode, which is where we ask you a question. You write us an email at hello@16to1.com. Submit your answer. If it's wrong, if it's right, if it's partially correct, whatever, we send you stickers.
Yeah.
It's a great deal.
We'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Last episode.
From the original SAT. The SAT was first tested by 8,000 students in 1926. All the way back then. It's almost 100 years old, the SAT. It was 97 minutes, that first test, and consisted of 315 questions focusing on vocabulary and math. Time released 8 of the original questions. Here's one of the originals from that very first test. If a man's salary is $20 a week and he spends $14 a week, how long will it take him to save $300? If you can believe it, this was a multiple choice question, and the answer was B, 50 weeks.
Great job.
All right, what's this episode's question?
If you were around in the 90s, you very likely remember the ads for Hooked on Phonics. It was originally... You do?
I do.
Yeah, me too. I remember it being on it was always late at night and you'd hear the TV during the infomercial hours where there was no other programming.
Hooked on Phonics, also that other one with, I think it was foreign language.
Oh, it was Rosetta Stone.
No, it was Muzzy.
Never heard of that.
It's
I only
this
ever
guy.
heard of Rosetta Stone. Let me see him. Oh, he kind of.
So I remember Hooked on Phonics.
It's kind of a distant bell.
Yeah, I remember Muzzy and Hooked on Phonics.
So we're talking about Hooked on Phonics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it was originally created in 1987, and it was all over TVs in the 90s, suggesting that they could teach kids everything they needed to know if their parents or whomever just bought them Hooked on Phonics.
Yes.
At its height, how much was Hooked on Phonics bringing in yearly?
The yearly revenue of Hooked on Phonics?
Yes.
Okay.
So, one thing to mention, they did have to declare bankruptcy because of some concerns with the Federal Trade Commission over deceptive advertising.
No way!
Which caused them to have to change their ways. And I would argue that maybe their deceptive advertising is why I still remember these ads so vividly. And I'm 34 and I never used Hooked on Phonics.
Yeah, I never used Hooked on Phonics either. Okay.
So,
wow, I didn't know they declared bankruptcy.
Okay.
All right. Want to talk about what we learned in the past couple of weeks?
Can we go first?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, I am a Swiftie. And Taylor Swift just released her most recent album, The Tortured Poets Department. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I learned about the origin of the phrase, the it girl.
The it girl.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you know this origin?
I don't think I
Like
know.
someone's an it girl, you know, like they're
I mean,
all
I've
that.
heard that
Okay.
phrase.
So the origin comes from a woman named Clara Bow. That's a title of a song on Taylor Swift's new album. That's
Gotcha.
why I looked this person
Clara
up.
Bow. Okay.
So this woman named Clara Bow was in the movie It, not Scary, and she became the It girl because she was featured in the movie It. She was one of the most famous actors of her time. She appeared in 46 silent films and 11 talkies. Her presence in a movie was said to have ensured investors a safe return, and the odds were almost 2-1 if you had Clara Bow in the film.
Okay, so
And
this
that's
is
how
not
people-
the scary, like,
No.
balloon it.
No. This is like 100 years ago, It girl.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
What'd you learn?
So we're fans of the show For All Mankind.
We are.
Which is an alternate retelling of the space race based
Just got
on...
supported for their 5th season.
Yeah, they were renewed for season
Renewed.
5. Neither of us were all that impressed with season 4, sadly. I think the writing took a little bit of a hit with maybe the writer's strike or something. But anyway, interesting space show. Alternate history of the space race based on if the cosmonauts had gotten there first, basically, gotten to the moon first. But anyway, part of the plot of that show in this latest season that we watched is capturing a giant asteroid for mining operations, because asteroids often have precious metals and all kinds of stuff that would make anyone filthy rich if it were to be captured. And what I learned is that there is an asteroid called Psyche that NASA is sending a spacecraft toward. And the idea is
With people on it?
No, unmanned spacecraft.
Okay.
They're sending it. They announced they were going to set off for a faraway asteroid named 16 Psyche. It's thought to contain precious metals, including gold, iron, and nickel. This asteroid's supposed to be worth $10,000 quadrillion. It's just a lot of zeros.
I don't even know what that converts to.
It's many, many, many zeros.
How much does this thing weigh?
It's also 2.5 billion miles away. So
Okay.
there's
yeah.
there's a spacecraft traveling through deep space. It's going toward this asteroid.
What's the plan when it gets there?
Well, they're going to study it and then maybe think about how to bring
Drag it home?
back. Yeah. I think the show does a very interesting job of talking about this, because if you can imagine, this is like a world-shattering amount of potential precious metals. Like, it would upset the world economy for whomever captures this thing.
Maybe
You can
we
imagine
leave it
in real
where it
life we
is.
have some working out to do there, as if we have such a planet-altering resource available to
Yeah.
us. How do we handle it? And I think it's an interesting question. But yeah.
Okay,
Anyway,
well, I hope
that's
I
what
don't
learned.
live to see that happen. How many years does it take to get there?
I think it's supposed to reach there by 2029.
Oh, so I might live for this. Yeah, but they got to get it back, and
Spacecraft.
how do you mine it in space and then just keep returning back and forth? Because surely you can't drag that thing to Earth.
Okay, well, the spacecraft is supposed to orbit the asteroid for just over 2 years and take a bunch of measurements. And then it's going to approach Mars in 2026.
So we got some time.
Yeah, I don't know.
This is a far off.
There are
event.
details, but anyway, I just thought it was super
Okay.
interesting that we've got one of these like mega rich asteroid
Good luck, Psyche.
scenarios, and we are maybe actually going to have to figure out really how to handle it as a planet.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You don't bring it to Earth, right? You mine it up there and bring the goods back and forth?
I don't think anybody knows the answer to that.
I can't imagine you want something like that crashing into Earth.
That would be my yikes. If I were going to identify a yikes,
One yike.
here's a yike for you. Yeah. If I were going to say yikes to this, it would be in the idea of if you get your calculation, your orbital mechanics ever so slightly askew,
Okay.
you could cause an
So maybe we-
Earth-ending event.
Right. So maybe we keep it just out there and we just go back and forth. All right. Well,
So anyway,
anyways,
that's what I learned. There's an asteroid out there.
let's just start with literacy and maybe deal with asteroids later.
Let's learn to read before
US.
we capture asteroids.
Okay. We'll see you next episode.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Goodbye.
Bye. Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. Oh, it was Rosetta Stone.
No, it was like Fozzie. There's like a Fozzie character. I can't
Fozzie?
remember. Hold on.
Like the Muppet?
Wait a minute.
Like Fozzie Bear? He's not a Muppet, is he? Is Fozzie Bear a Muppet?
No, I'm not talking about Fozzie. Hold on. What's Muzzy?
Who the f*** is Muzzy?